debunking the 80-20 training myth. Wait, I have to approve for this to be recorded. I did. Okay. Is Thanasis with us? Thanasi, are you here?
Don't see him.
I don't see him. Maybe he just got out, but he'll join us in a minute,
Okay.
along with anyone else coming from our side.
Okay.
Well, obviously, we'll conduct this session in English, and our members that can understand English will participate, and then we'll try to use AI to caption it and put it on our Facebook group for everyone else to under to be able to follow what has been said with captions in Greek.
Okay.
Um, okay, so we'd like to hear about. I'm here. Everything is perfect. He says. Uh, okay, we cannot see you though, or hear you. Θανάση, μας ακούς? Are you seeing the messages that pop up on the chat, Jason?
Yeah. Yeah, I see
Okay,
him.
good.
He says everything okay.
He says everything okay, although for some reason I
I
cannot
don't,
see
yeah,
him or
I don't
hear
see him
him.
either. I only
Okay,
see
maybe he
you.
has some connection things. He'll sort them out.
Okay.
Let's give him
Okay.
some time. Okay, technically we need one more minute until it's 11, and we have everyone
Okay.
else join us.
Okay. He says my camera
Okay,
today
his
is
camera today will be off. Okay,
okay.
okay,
Okay.
but can you talk? Can we hear you, Thanasi? You probably can't. Anyway,
He says yes,
yes,
I
I
can
can talk.
tell.
Άνοιξε μικρόφωνο, Θανάση. Okay, and here you have our good friend and other main contributor to this group, Dimitris Fergadiotis, who's joining us. Kalispera, Dimitri.
Καλησπέρα.
Okay. Technically, it's 11 a.m., so I think we can start. There's no point in waiting for everyone else to
Okay.
join us. So, if you don't mind, we can start by discussing the 80-20 training myth. I have read this with great interest, and it came at a very good timing for me because I had this disagreement with a friend of mine like 10 days ago because his coach gives him some painfully slow runs. And I'm telling him, you're not supposed to do this. It makes you slower. It's very much different to how it applies to elites and how it applies to us amateurs. I don't see the point in adding so many junk miles to your weekly miles. So if you want to tell us about your research on the matter, oh wait, we have to excuse me, we have to say hello to some other people joining us. We have Thodoros Fotopoulos joining us, who has been a great marathoner, and he's a regular in our sessions. Well, he's disconnected. Anyway, so you can go ahead and start discussing the 80-20 principle and how it applies to the elites versus amateurs.
Sure. Well, there's a lot of things I could say about this. The first thing is that it was never meant to be a prescription. Where this comes from originally is from research on looking at what elite endurance athletes do across several different sports, running, cross-country skiing, cycling. And there's been one researcher in Norway who did his PhD work in the US and he moved to Norway. He's been the prominent researcher in this area, Stephen Seiler. And so a lot of the research comes from him. And it's descriptive research. It's just documenting what elite endurance athletes do. And he noticed that if you take all of their training, that about 80% or so of it comes from intensities below the lactate threshold, and the rest is above threshold. But then he also found that if you acknowledge that, like on hard days, like when he first found that 80-20, he noticed that like on hard interval days, you do your warm up and your cool down, that's also at a low intensity, but that doesn't give you a clear indication of what that day of training was. It was actually a hard day, but it's skewed more towards the slower end because you have more miles of warm up and cool down than you do of the workout itself. So when he really dug into that aspect, then he noticed that it's really about 90% easy and 10% hard. But whatever the percentage comes out to be, that research is really just documenting what elite athletes do. But elite athletes are not planning their training that way. I lived in Kenya for a little while and I saw what they do, and nobody is planning their training to come out to some percentage of easy versus some percentage of hard. It just so happens that if you run a lot, like if you run over 100 miles a week, or then kilometers be over 160 kilometers a week, that most of it has to come out to be at a low intensity because it can't be any other way. There's an inverse relationship between volume and intensity. If
Hmm.
you take that continuum all the way down to what sprinters do, sprinters are high intensity every single day, but their total volume is very, very low. So you have to take that into consideration that the more work you do, the more of it is going to become at a lower intensity because you can't run 160 kilometers a week and have half of it be above your lactate threshold intensity. You're going to run yourself into the ground. It's not even possible to do that. So the first consideration is that this was never meant to be a prescription of how runners should train. It's just really a documentation of what elite endurance athletes do. But like I said, the reason why such a large percentage comes out to being considered at a lower intensity is simply an artifact of the very high volumes that elite endurance athletes accomplish. So that if everybody else tried to run as much as elite endurance athletes, they too would have most of it be at a lower intensity. It can't be any other way, because if there is one rule of endurance training, it's that there's an inverse relationship between volume and intensity. The lower the volume you do, the more intensity you can handle, and vice versa. So that's the first issue. The second issue is that because elite endurance athletes have such a high VO2 max, you can make the argument that they get more out of running at a lower intensity. Like if you take an elite male endurance athlete who has a VO2 max of 80 or above, I
Hmm.
mean, some of these Norwegian cross-country skiers have a VO2 max crossing over 90 mLs per kg per minute. But let's just say you take your average elite endurance athlete who has a VO2 max of 80 or 70 for a female. When they're running easy at even 60% of that VO2 max, which may be about 70% of max heart rate, 60% of 80 is 48, right? 6 times 8 is 48. It's 48 mLs per kg per minute. That's higher than the VO2 max of most recreational runners. And so
Indeed.
even when an elite endurance athlete is running at 60%, they're still getting a very high oxidative flux to the muscle, a lot of blood flow. And that's one of the ways, that's the major way in which we build more capillaries, is from this very high flux of blood going to the muscle because of the shear stress. When you have a lot of blood being pushed into the muscle vasculature, that causes a shear stress on the walls of the capillaries. And that's the major stimulus for the big term for that is angiogenesis, the formation of new blood vessels. And so you need a high blood flow to cause that shear stress on the walls of the blood vessels. When a recreational runner is running easy, if they're running 60%, they have a VO2 max of 40, half that of a elite endurance athlete, 60% of 40 is only 24 mLs per kg per minute. So even though the relative amount of oxygen is still the same because it's the percentage of their max, but the absolute oxidative flux, the absolute amount of blood flow going to the muscle is much less in a
Hmm.
recreation runner when they're running easy compared to when an elite athlete is running easy. And so the argument could be made that an elite endurance athlete gets a greater stimulus for adaptation when running easy at a low percentage of their VO2 max because they have such a high VO2 max to begin with. And so I would argue that for a recreational runner to get the same absolute of oxidative flux, of blood flow to the muscle, they have to run more than an elite endurance athlete is running. They have to run more kilometers per week so that they equal the same absolute amount of oxygen being transferred to the muscle and the same amount of blood flow going to the muscle because they can't do it in any one session. So they have to accumulate more sessions, more total volume than an elite athlete. And these are things that are typically missed by all these proponents of the 80-20. They miss these subtleties of the training and what's happening physiologically. So I would argue that, the less somebody runs, the more of it should be at a higher intensity if they're interested in getting fit. Otherwise, it's going to take them a long time to get fit. Plus, a recreational runner, the number of times they run per week is a lot less than an elite endurance athlete. Again, that research on the descriptive research that is documented as 80-20 or 90-10, depending on how you look at it. They're running 10 to 14 times per week. When I was living in Kenya, they run twice a day, every day, except for Sunday, their long run, which then they just do one run a day. Saturday, they take off completely. So they're running 11 times per week. 5 times 2 is 10 plus 1. They're running 11 times per week. Whereas 90% of recreational distance run, even if they're a good recreational runner, they're not running 11 times per week. And so that has to be considered as well. And again, when elite endurance athletes are running easy, they're getting more of a stimulus. They're doing it more often. They have a greater oxidative flux to the muscle, more total blood flow going to the muscle. So these are things that the public doesn't seem to want to understand. They see the 80-20, they attach themselves to it, and now all of a sudden it's a prescription for everybody. But that's never been the way it was meant to do. The other issue is, well, how do you define what 80% easy is? I mean, by the definition in the literature, anything below lactate threshold is considered in that 80% easy. But you could still make a very hard workout, even if you're running below lactate. If you're running 10 to 15 seconds per mile slower or 6 to 9 seconds per kilometer slower, but you're doing it long enough. If you go on a 20-kilometer sub-threshold run, that's still very demanding. You're exhausted by the end. But by the definition of that research, that would still be considered of a low intensity. But that doesn't give you a clear indication of the training that day because it's still a very hard workout. You're exhausted by the end of the tempo run. So these are all things that nobody considers. They just run with that 80-20 number and act like that's a magical thing that you have to do. So if you're going to run 60 kilometers a week, then 80% of that should be at a low intensity and 20% should be hard. And that doesn't make any sense to train that way. Another issue, I mean, I could keep bringing up more and more issues, but another issue is it shouldn't be the same all year long. The training evolves through different phases. So in a classic aerobic base phase of training, the predominant amount will be done at a lower intensity. But then when you're getting closer to racing, then a higher percentage of it is at a higher intensity. Arthur Lydiard talked about this, in the 1950s and 60s. So this has been around for a long time. And so the training intensity distribution changes throughout the year. It's not always the same, but nobody ever talks about that either. They just throw this 80-20 number at people and act like that's the gospel.
Yeah. So you would say that for a recreational runner that runs, I don't know, 70 or even 80 kilometers a week, and which is like 6 or 7 sessions a week, and their VO2 max is somewhere in the 50s, respecting this, abiding to this 80-20 principle means they're not pushing hard enough. If I understand you.
That depends on where they are in their training. Like if you take someone who's brand new to running, any stimulus is going to be a great stimulus for adaptation. But then once they've done that for several years, then now they have to start running at a higher intensity. And over time, the way the training should progress is, everyone talks about volume or intensity. Nobody talks about the volume of intensity. And over the years of progression, if someone wants to keep getting better and better, they have to increase the volume of work done at a higher intensity. The volume of intensity that's the key that needs to progress, not just doing more volume or doing more intensity, but doing more intensity, the latter, that needs to progress. The volume of intensity needs to progress. And so to answer your question, yeah, initially somebody will benefit from just sticking to the 80-20 if they want to, but then they're going to hit a wall at some point and they're not going to keep getting better. They're going to plateau. And then they have to manipulate the percentages that they work with if they continue to want to get
Mhm.
better. Because the
Mhm.
research is clear on this. Veronique Billat in France has done a lot of this research to show that when somebody is already highly trained, then the intensity of training starts to matter more than the volume. Once you've already accomplished a high volume and you're used to running, 90, 100 plus kilometers per week, then you got to do something more than that. You have to start addressing the intensity of training to really push the VO2 max. I mean, we already know that to improve VO2 max, while initially it could come from just volume, that once you've already done a lot of volume, to really focus on the heart's ability to pump blood and oxygen, that the intensity matters more than the volume does once somebody has already accomplished a significant amount of volume.
Mhm. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yes. You mentioned your stay in Kenya, and this brings us to another question we had. I would like you to describe this experience to us a little bit and tell us about the differences in the way Kenyans are raised and are trained as opposed to athletes in the West.
Yeah, the major difference, if I sum it up in one statement, the big difference between the Kenyan runners and Western runners is that in the West, running is something we do, whereas in Kenya, running is who they are. They grow up running back and forth to school. I mean, I saw them, the kids were running. I mean, it's a very small town. The epicenter of Kenyan distance running is a very small rural town. You don't have to go looking for the runners. They're right there in your face every day. And so the schools that are in this town, the kids see the runners running by every day, and they're walking and running back and forth to school every day. No one's taking transportation. They don't have cars. No one's taking transportation to school. And so everything is on their feet. And so they literally grow up as runners. It's who they are as animals, just like other animals run in the wild. That's the way the Kenyan runners are. They grow up with this. And so by the time they're in their 20s, they're much more aerobically developed and also structurally developed. I mean, their legs are used to running on red dirt, rocky roads. There's very few paved roads in the rural towns. And so they're running in such a way that their skeleton has adapted to the stress. And so that's how they grow up. And then you combine that with the sociology of it all, that running is their way out of poverty. There's not many opportunities for jobs there. It's not like over here in the US. You could become a doctor, you could become a lawyer, you could become a business owner, you could do anything you want. Over there, they don't go to college. Most of them are uneducated. They don't have opportunities. They don't have any money. They view running as their only way out of poverty to change their lives and their families' lives. And so you combine this this anatomy that they have, the long, slender Achilles tendons, the very little muscle mass on their legs, which is great for running economy. They have the mechanics for running, they have the body architecture, and then they have the physiology. You combine that with this desperate need to be good at this because it is their only way to make a better life for themselves and get out of poverty, and
Mhm.
then you have the recipe for success. And that's why they're so good. There's no scientific training being done over there. They have no idea what VO2 max is or lactate threshold. Most of the Kenyan runners, people only hear about the ones who have made it, the Eliud Kipchoge's of the world,
Mhm.
or Sebastian Sawe, who just broke the world record and ran the 159. These are the
We'll get to
people
that.
the
I
public
wanted to
hears
ask you
about.
about that.
Yeah, this is what the public hears about, but they don't hear about the thousands and thousands of other Kenyan runners who live in severe poverty, no running water, no bathroom, no toilet to flush, and they don't have very little food to eat all day. And then I saw this when I was living there. I saw the way they live. I mean, I couldn't believe how they live and how they're still able to accomplish an enormous volume of training on such little food and not having the standards that we have in the West. And so it's quite remarkable how they're able to do what they do. But it also proves the point that you don't really need a lot of food. Metabolism is trainable, and they have trained their metabolism to squeeze out as much energy out of every calorie they consume. And so it's a remarkable situation over there that people don't realize unless you go there and you live there and you see what goes on. But there's no scientific training. They don't understand these concepts. They just run a lot and they have the talent for it. And when you take talent and you combine it with a lot of training, regardless of what that training is composed of, that's what makes you successful. It starts from the talent, and that's what they have over there. And so, yeah, it's a pretty interesting situation to go there. I advise anybody. I wrote a book about my experience called Coaching the Kenyans because I wanted to document, what goes on there and what people don't usually see and hear about. And so, yeah, I recommend, anyone taking the trip to go. If you're really into running, it's a great trip to go there. Because the other interesting thing about the runners in Kenya, that there's about 40 tribes. They have a tribal system in Kenya. There's about 40 different tribes. There's only one tribe that is the runners. People think Kenya, that everybody runs in Kenya. But most of them don't. There's 56 million people in Kenya. Most of them don't run. It's just this one tribe of Kenyans, the Kalenjin,
The
that are,
Kalenjin.
yeah,
Yeah.
that they're the really good runners. And so it's remarkable that in this country that has 40 different tribes, it's this one ancestry, it's this one slice of the Kenyan population. And so that makes you realize that most of this is genetic. They have a very, unique ancestry that is really built for running. And that's why over in the US, we can't compete with that because we have a very heterogeneous population in the US, whereas in Kenya, the runners come from this one ancestry, this one common ancestry. And that's why they can all do the same training and it works for all of them because they're all of the same type. In the US, you put a group of runners together, it's very hard to come up with a training plan for that one group of runners because that one group is very, very heterogeneous. But in Kenya, the groups are very homogeneous because they all come from that one tribe, that one same ancestry. And so it's pretty remarkable to see how this one small slice of Kenya produces all these world champions and Olympic medalists, and it's remarkable.
Yeah, and even the second tier Kenyans that you get at the smaller races in Europe, they're still pretty good. They're still better
They're
than
very good,
their
yeah.
European counterparts, good enough to win those races and get the prize money when they come over, although they will never become the Kipchogis.
Right,
But, I mean, I'm talking about runners who these days they run marathons between 2007 and 2012, which is probably enough to win a race like the Athens Marathon, for example. But it will not make you the world champion or world record man, especially the way the world record has evolved. But
right,
what you're describing is a bit more primitive than what I had in my head, because I understand that from a certain point on, you had Western coaches and agents and sponsors who have set up shop in Kenya, and they're looking to both help the Kenyans train in a more scientific way, but also obviously to get business deals and endorsements and all that out of this. So I was expecting the situation to be slightly better than what you're describing. I mean, I was thinking that at least they do have running water, and you have all these
yeah,
camps that are
yeah.
advertised to Westerners to go there and train in altitude. So,
Right. Yeah, only the best runners. So like Eliud Kipchoge in his camp, and Faith Kipyegon's in the same camp. And so it's only the best runners who have access to that. But
mhm.
the masses of Kenyan runners, the thousands and thousands of them, they don't have that. And so they don't have running water. I talk about in the book, I visited the homes of the people I was coaching, and they live in a shack. They have no running water. They have no cooking supplies. They have like a little charcoal stove that sits on the ground. That's how they cook their food. And they have to go outside into a hole in the ground to go to the bathroom. And they don't have anything. And it's very primitive. And it's sad. I mean, these are such talented athletes, and most of them don't have, what we take for granted. And so yeah, I mean, only like the shoe companies that have sponsored the athletes who set up in a camp, only those athletes have what they need because they're getting financially supported. But the majority of Kenyan runners are not financially supported. And so they're just scrounging around every day trying to figure out how to make money so they can buy food. It's a very sad situation over there, but it's unfortunate because the 1,000th best Kenyan runner can beat the 10th best American. And it's unbelievable.
American.
Yeah, the depth
Because
of talent there.
I thought the level in the US has picked up in the last 10 years or
It
so.
has, but we still only have maybe two or three men and two or three women who can run with the Kenyans. That's
Hmm.
what I find so funny. I mean, not to knock my own country, but we talk so much about how successful American distance runners are. We have maybe two or three or four people out of a country of 340 million. We have maybe two or three or four who can keep up with the Kenyans, but they have thousands over there who can beat. I mean, our 10th best, who's our 10th best marathoner? I mean, I couldn't even tell you, but you know how few guys we have who can run under a 2:10 marathon? There aren't that many when you consider the size of our
I
population.
probably I probably can mention most of them by name, I guess.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
Conor Mans
But in
and
Kenya, you go live in
yeah.
Iten, Kenya, and everyone you talk to can run a 2:10 marathon. It's not special there. Everyone I met over there is a 2:10 marathoner. But over there, 2:10 doesn't get you anywhere. For an agent to be interested in you, for an agent to be willing to spend their own money to have you travel to Europe or the US to go run a race, they're taking a risk on these athletes. And so you have to be really, really fast for an agent to be willing to take that financial risk on you. When I
Mhm.
first got there, I was sitting in the high altitude training center there, which is owned by Lorna Kiplagat. She after she won as much money as she did in her career, she built a training center in E10, and there's a little cafe that sits right outside the gate of the training center. And when I first got there, I was sitting inside the cafe, and I overheard a conversation at the table of a manager who was talking to an athlete. And the manager basically told the athlete that he's not going to be interested in him unless they were talking about half marathon. And unless he ran a 101 half marathon, the agent wasn't interested. I mean, in the US, how many guys we have who can run a 101 half, you can count them on one hand. But
Mhm.
over there, there's so many of them that unless you can run, 60 minutes or faster for a half marathon, a manager is not interested in you.
Yeah. I don't know if you're seeing the chat because there's a question by Yannis Zanetakis, who's himself a renowned coach and exercise physiologist here in Greece. And he's asking if someone has unlimited ability to stay at altitude, for example, at 2,400 meters, after how long would we expect the physiological adaptations to altitude to plateau? And does it still make sense for someone to remain in that altitude for a very long period of time?
Yeah, it's a good question. Altitude physiology is one of my big areas of interest. So I can summarize the whole body of altitude physiology research that the ideal time to go to altitude is about 4 to 8 weeks. After that, when you spend a long time at altitude, you have this balancing act. On one hand, you make more red blood cells, so you have greater oxygen transport capability. But on the other hand, you're doing all of your workouts at a slower speed. So the motor unit recruitment, the neural aspect of running, recruiting these motor units to be able to run at a given speed. If you spend too long there and you do all your workouts at a slower speed, then if that starts to outweigh the increase in red blood cells for the greater oxygen transport, you could theoretically make yourself slower because every time you do a workout, you're running at a slower speed. So altitude training really is this balancing act between making more red blood cells on the one hand, getting the positive effects of altitude on one hand, versus not running slower on the other hand for too long. And so that's why the research then has looked into the best strategies to use altitude is to live at altitude and do your easy aerobic running at altitude, but do the harder workouts as close to sea level as possible so you can still maintain the training intensity.
Hmm.
But that's hard to do because there's not too many places in the world where you can easily go back and forth between high altitude and sea level or close to sea level. So a lot of people use these gimmicks, the altitude tents and things like that, to try to live at altitude but
Yeah.
train at sea level. So they try to simulate that environment with the altitude tents, but there aren't too many places where you can easily drive back and forth between altitude and sea level, within a couple of hours drive or something. But that
Yeah.
would be the best way to do it if you could, is to live at altitude and do your aerobic easy running at altitude, but then do all the quality workouts to maintain the intensity at as close to sea level as you can. If you're going to go to an altitude camp, 4 to 8 weeks seems to be the ideal time, and then race soon after that when you come back down to sea level. The lifetime
Giannis
of a red,
mentioned, I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say the lifetime of a red blood cell is about 90 days. So every 90 days or every 3 months, you're remaking red blood cells. So to answer the other part of that question, in about 3 months' time, after you go to altitude and you come back down to sea level, within about 3 months' time, 90 days' time, then you will no longer have the benefits of that short-term altitude camp. But also, having said that, I think altitude gets over exaggerated. If you look at, I mean, it just so happens that the Kenyans and Ethiopians, the best runners in the world, come from altitude, but that's not the reason why they're so successful. It just so happens that if you look at other cultures, you look at the United States, for example, historically, our best distance runners have been born and trained at sea level. If altitude really made a difference, then you would expect in a vast country like the US, you would expect the US's best runners, or you would expect a greater percentage of the US's best runners to come from altitude compared to the percentage of the population that happens to live there. And that's not been the case. Our
Yeah.
best runners, with the exception of a few, have been born and raised and trained at sea level. But then as adults, they think that altitude is the secret. So then they go to altitude to train. And then because they're successful, people then say, oh, it must be the altitude. But it's not. It's just that it's the most talented runners that seek out the altitude because they want to get an edge and they think that altitude is that edge.
Hmm. I know the
But
better
altitude
American
in and of
distance runners.
itself is not the reason. The main reason, I mean, we spend a lot of time talking about training. Everybody wants to know what the best training is, but what really drives performance is the talent, the genetics. That's the single biggest thing that's going to make somebody a really good runner, whether they're a good recreational runner or they're an Olympic champion. What really drives this is the talent. Now, sometimes that talent happens to be born at altitude, and
Yeah.
sometimes that talent happens to be born at sea level. But it's the talent that really makes the difference. I mean, for a long time, I don't know how familiar you guys are with like American distance runners, but Joan Samuelson was the American
Hmm.
record holder in the marathon for a long time. She ran 2:21 for a marathon back in 1985. She was the
Hmm.
84 Olympic champion. It
Hmm.
took a long time before another American broke her American record in the marathon. Joan Samuelson was born and raised at sea level. And it's
Hmm.
true for a lot of athletes in the U.S. Alan Webb, who broke the American mile record and who broke Jim Ryan's high school record. Jim Ryan ran a 3:55 mile in high school in the 1960s in the U.S. He grew up in Kansas at sea level. And it took
Hmm.
35 years, 36 years before Alan Webb broke that record. He ran 3:53 for a mile in high school. Alan Webb grew up in Virginia at sea level. There's so many examples of American distance runners who were the best in the world who grew up at sea level. But people still seem to think that altitude is the secret sauce, that you have to train at altitude in order to be successful. But it's the talent before anything else that determines this.
That's what I was going to ask you before, because I know that right now the better American distance runners choose to live in places like Boulder or Flagstaff to go for that altitude effect. So I understand you're thinking this is exaggerated. It's probably a fad among them, and it doesn't
Right,
really give them the actual benefits they think it
right.
does.
They think it
Oh,
does. So they move to altitude and set up a camp there because they think that that's the secret. But yeah, if you look at like the training camps that are in the US right now, there's the Flagstaff is a big hub and Boulder is a big hub. But you look at the athletes who are training there, they're the most talented athletes to begin with.
in the first place, yeah, yep,
Right.
yep,
And
yeah.
so, yeah,
I see
people,
your
and they're
point.
usually also East African. Like there's a group in Boulder trained by, coached by Dathan Ritzenhein, who is like a 3 or 4 time Olympian from the US, who himself grew up in Michigan. Grew up at sea level. But
Yeah.
his best runner, Helen Obiri, she's Kenyan, and she was a great runner, at the 800 meters before she eventually moved up to the marathon. And the same with all these athletes. The best athletes in these sponsored groups in the US, they're all East African. So people don't realize it's the talent, it's not the altitude.
Okay, so Thanasis has just rang the bell of the final lap for this first session, to use a track reference. And we have 3 minutes left, he says. I'd like to use these 3 minutes as we're talking about US athletes. There's a lot of talk, especially here in Greece, about how the state, uh, the state as in the country, can support athletes to help them become professionals. And it's commonly accepted that the current system is not very efficient. Some people are nostalgic about the previous system, which was basically everyone who's a good athlete, let's get them in the armed forces just so that they get a steady paycheck. At the end of the day, it was causing a situation where everybody was basically or in the Navy, the Army, or the Air Force, or even the fire department somewhere, but just to have this steady paycheck. And they were obviously never reporting for duty in these services. I would like you to briefly explain to someone who is not familiar with this how the high school and collegiate sports system works in the US and what is the path that takes an athlete from adolescence to the point of becoming a pro as an early teen or in their early 20s, if we have the time. Otherwise, we'll continue after the break.
Yeah, I may need more than 3 minutes for that one.
I'm suspecting this, so at
Yeah,
least start saying something and we'll pick it up after
yeah.
the break.
Yeah, we have a big problem in the US. The US, not to knock on my own country, but we rely on the size of our population to be successful. When you have a large population, the emphasis we place on sports, the cream that rises to the top is going to be pretty rich cream. But we have a very poor system outside of schools. So we have very good high school collegiate system, and that's our feeder system. Our Olympians come from our college system. But once the college athletes graduate, then it all falls apart. Then they try to rely on a shoe company to get a sponsor. So all these shoe companies now have to jump in to try to support these athletes, which it's not their responsibility. They shouldn't have to do that. But they do that because there's no other way for our best college runners to get to the next level, the national level, the international level, because they don't have financial support.
Sorry
So
for interrupting. It will
yeah,
go off any minute now.
yeah,
When it does, we'll just join back